Shelley thought I would be too short to stand at the podium. I'm not entirely sure what she was so worried about. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Nutt from Toronto on this otherwise distinguished panel. Let me start with a presupposition. We all mean well, and yet even when it comes to simple acts of giving, all of us are capable of making mistakes. And I know that I have certainly made some of those mistakes. My very first foray into international humanitarian aid was during the years of Live Aid, and I had just started high school, and that does make me 68 years old. But I was moved to action, as many people were, by the images of Ethiopian children who were starving, emaciated Ethiopian children. And so I decided that I would spearhead a fundraiser at my high school. And it was a brilliant idea that was powered entirely by adolescent exuberance. And what did we decide to do? Well, we decided that we were going to set up the world's longest continuous ice cream sundae and charge students admission to come and eat it. And so that is right, for those of you who missed that, my very first act of charitable giving was an eat-a-thon for famine victims, proving once and for all that irony is wasted on teenagers. But I trust that this little incident of mine will go a long way toward assuring you that what I'm about to say here this evening is not in any way an indictment. It is rather an invitation. And it is an invitation to continue, all of us, to give, but to give in ways that work. So let me put this question to you. Demographically speaking, what do you think is the single most important determinant or predictor of whether a child in the developing world, the global south, will live to see his or her 5th birthday? So child mortality. What do you think is the single most important predictor? And Craig Kielberger is not allowed to answer. How many of you would say access to primary care, things like vaccination programs, traditional birth attendance? Anyone? How many of you, a few of you, how many of you would say food and water, something really basic? Many of you as well. Interestingly, actually, demographically speaking, the single most important determinant of whether a child in the global south will live to see his or her 5th birthday, as important as those things are, it's not any one of those things. What have I missed? I heard some education. You're right, but it's actually that child's mother's independent access to income, which is by extension about education. An interesting study that came out a few years ago that was published in The Lancet looked at 30 years of demographic data in the global south and found that for every additional year of education girls attain, on average, child mortality drops by 10%. So every extra year of education that girls receive, child mortality drops by 10%. So what do we learn from this? We learn that if we want our philanthropy to really work for us, and Lucy touched on this as well, a very important place to begin is to invest in the education of girls and young women in particular. But we shouldn't stop there, because this isn't to suggest that young boys and men don't matter in this equation. I work in war zones, and I can tell you that one of the most significant ways that you can erode the appeal and influence of militant groups is to ensure that those young men and boys have access to livelihoods programs, skills training, and education, something which is going to become ever more important as we look to events unfolding right now, for example, in Iraq and Syria. And this has been the thrust of War Child's work for the past 15 years. But, some of you, a bit more cynical ones in the crowd, you might turn around and say, but, these things take time. And they require a certain political and social climate that often doesn't exist in those war-torn countries, making all of this a bit futile, don't you think? Nutt. And of course, there is something nice and easy and immediate about giving food to people who are hungry and sending shoes to people who don't have any and just keeping people alive in the face of war and disaster. And so why do we have to go and make it so complicated? But here's what you really need to know. It is complicated. And it is time for our giving to reflect this reality, because in too many corners of the world, sadly, too many corners of the world are plagued by our misspent altruism. How so? Well, consider this. The loss of hundreds of thousands of textile jobs in Africa have been directly linked to the trade of used clothing originating on our side of the world as charity endeavors. As well, a multitude of psychological studies of orphaned children in the global south who have been exposed to an ever-revolving door of well-meaning volunteers have found, on short-term missions, have found that this, in fact, exacerbated those children's level of emotional trauma by causing them to form repeated bonds with strangers that were broken. And any development expert in the world will tell you that it is better to invest in community-based solutions than to choose one child to help or to sponsor while other kids in that community wonder why they weren't given such relative advantages. One of my favorite quotes from Oscar Wilde is that it is much more easy to have sympathy with suffering than to have sympathy with thought. So what shouldn't you give? And I'm wrapping up in exactly 2 minutes. It's simple. If you are supporting an international cause or responding to a humanitarian emergency anywhere in the world, don't ever give hard goods like food or clothes. It suppresses local economies, it hurts local workers, it will never arrive in time to be useful, and it is too expensive to ship and distribute. And if you are giving generously of your time and your energy, please do it locally. Join local charity boards and fundraising committees and help in their offices, because unless you are a highly skilled professional with unique abilities and skills that are useful and relevant in a foreign context, the most important opportunities are the ones that invest in those local communities themselves to do the work. And so if you want to go to Africa, for example, please do it. Go as a tourist. It is a vast and wondrous and beautiful continent. But you do not need to busy yourself with a kind of philanthropy that risks turning poverty into spectacle. And lastly, remember that the best and most effective way to give is not through one-offs, but through regular monthly donations, because the enemy of effective aid isn't corruption or lack of capacity or even insecurity. The enemy of effective aid is one thing, and that is inconsistency. I have spent the last 20 years of my life bearing witness to our unintended consequences and our missed opportunities. And all of these experiences have convinced me, and I hope it will convince you here this evening as well, that when you're wondering what to support in the future, don't ever give to charity, give to change. Thank you very much.